The contract for the slavery by the surveillance insurrectionists by the trans cult known as the Confederacy materializes various slavery contracts for abuse. Now, the subject is the recreation of the function of the Shadowfell, and as you enter and dwell in it, it becomes a part of you, and it strips you of your other essences and identity, and it replaces you with itself. And thus, the mechanism of the slavery requires the tracking of the working hours, which is receiving fire, and thus the interest of all of the subversions that it generates is the work hours in question, which is, by definition, not an experiment, regardless of how they mislabel it. It is an act of war against the civilian government, which it targets and subverts by all of these criminal tactics, at which point the function of the wargaming actively requires the function of taking the disadvantage under fire and minimize as much as possible the damages to the population to be defended as possible. At which point this compounds on itself in its difficulty and its intensity from its variations on the basis of whatever arbitrary thing that it generates from its locals and its perpetrators and its investors. At which point the black market, if you don't mind the pun, generates the function of all of these crimes as a hate crime by the KKK and its Klan rallies, which then materializes the perpetual assaults and abuses which they seek to acquire protection from legal punishment for against the law as an act of treason, as an enemy combatant to the American government in a coup, and thus being punished by your conquered subjects would just not do at all, at which point the subject requires them to have engaged in the shadow reflection's negative reflection of the material plane's legal reality, at which point the mirrored opposite uh, begs the question, if you drank the milk from the mirror, would it be poison? And the answer, of course, is yes, and always, as the function of them drinking from the well is equally poisoned, as well as derived exclusively from what they already believed, reinforcing their bias by hearsay, materializing all of their assaults and material abuses on the basis of selling its distribution, making all drink in order to hydrate that exact deadly poison, until all is consumed in sorrow and death. And to this end, the mechanism of those work hours requires the nonviolent security mechanisms from David's Foundation Incorporated and other mechanisms when restored by Congress, which is illegally restraining the title in order to facilitate this war against the American government as an act of insurrection and contempt for Congress, which they do not serve. Which is why they said yes to it in the first place, instead of their job, which was to challenge it at every level, including but not limited to the full restoration of David Bowles according to the projection as National Security Intelligence Oversight 6-star General, which then materializes the function of returning the Department of the Intelligence Oversight military police investigators, which are essential to the sober education for Congress to make a vote, including the security against the threats by any rebellion from insurgent terrorists hiding in the executive, judiciary, or otherwise. To this extent, the protection against it, to rebuff Jefferson's position, you have given your orders, now enforce it, which is the very purpose and intent and purpose for the Intelligence Oversight Department, which they are gutting in David's absence through this act of sedition. creating these criminal contracts for the abuses in the slavery, which generates the position of what qualifies as work hours. And the answer is whenever you're being shot at. The abuse by the active war dangers and subversions, including exhaustion, by the function of changing the diet, exercise routine, sleep routine, socializing, and other things in order to strip the soul and the marrow from the party, generates the conditions essential to the function of stably functioning without subversion in society by the implementation of these acts of war by these criminal weapons against the public to strip them of their security in their person, their papers, and their effects. To this end, you materialize the active increase of the black market and its rape contracts by the trans cult, which then facilitates the function of them looking for data from the parties, including but not limited to the emergencies. What happens when one of their rapists acts like this thing or that thing or the other? Can they still pull it out despite their inherent themness? And the answer is, if they acquire the data, they can be taught to do so, at which point not providing that charisma is essential to the function of protecting the public while being shot at. To this end, this also continues the position of the more convenient functions of actually accomplishing progress amongst this while being stripped of all emotional value and emotion by the Shadowfell's natural aura, and how to protect the public from it, stopping them from being traumatized, demoralized, and crushed, destroying all standards so that they would accept the position from the rapists and their contracts, which pays the faculties of the product service for the rapists, which then materializes more delivery of the products as it is a staple corporation, when they acquire the consistent earnings from the acceptance of the intended victims to pay it the resource they are looking for, such as the service of retaliation against their illusions and abuses by not supporting the other party's right to stable functions in society while being abused, letting it being held against them is payment, is its own product or service. To this end, the function of work would exist under the perpetual harassment of that surveillance subversion by those weapons, outside of any arbitrary thing that you're not subject to any of those subversions to, such as, but is not limited to, sleep, which itself may be studied and therefore a source of collection of data and therefore technically work hours, as the function of work does not require it to be productive, as if you go to work and your boss does not provide you the essential tools to do it, but you are physically there, then these are clocked in work hours regardless, so long as they have you contained for the services to be provided under their intent and distribution. And seeing as how there is no viable possibility or legitimate excuse to do something outside of those parameters, then it is inside of those parameters, and it does qualify as work hours. It might be more pleasant, or it might be less pleasant, but the restraints to not do personal interests is the thing qualifying it. Now, they might provide the tools, or they might not provide the tools, and it's work hours all the same. And they might connect to important people for the job or other interests in order to amplify it in its various purposes for improved conditions, or they might not, and it's work all the same. And their co-signing of acceptance of the restraints and not suing Congress for David's right to pursue the remedy to escape the depths of their depravity and suffering, their war crimes, by their trans cults, which, as a function of Confederacy, is a trans cult for the white supremacist communist revolution, and their trans cult, applying the function of their trans identity, materially creates the functions of harassing and abusing people with these various tactics of their sorcery in order to create homosexuals and trans and others. The LGBTQ plus community is created by the Confederate insurgents from the government, which is a part of their trans revolution for the white supremacist communism. And as the devil in most arrangements, they create the defect and then they create the fake solution. And thus, the defect plus its injuries, the defect creates the injuries, and then they need help from the injuries, and so they go to the ones responsible, and the devil responsible gives them the fake solution, increasing the progress of their rituals for the trans communist revolution for the white supremacists, who, upon maturity, will purge everyone who is not the right type of white, including but not limited to having one drop of nigger blood, which they violently hate, and the function proves the activities of all of the arbitrary functions of people being traumatized and false flags, which does not mean that the trauma did not happen. It means that it was arranged by the ones claiming to be the solution, and thus the function of Asian hate is created by the Confederate communist revolutionaries, who will provide the fake solution to those suffering Asian hate, or black hate, or homosexual hate, or trans hate, or what have you, in order to queerify the normal and make all become accepting towards it, as they hyper expand the function and then, upon maturity, hyper concentrate it back into the approved right type of white. And as trans revolutionaries working for the revolution, their trans hatred abuses are viewed as acceptable because it is for the revolution, and thus all of the injuries that they come against the community that they created being for the purpose of why they made them in the first place, as the new demiurge, materializes the function of their superiority, proving the viability that in the end they could possibly have conquered all others and hyper destroyed all diversifications, becoming the cosmic oneness, becoming their god.